Hey there! You are likely here from Jttyzzle's video, which is going in-depth with the UGC process. This video is a reference made during that video regarding an explanation of realm object communication, and why it's tricky to make them do that. In this video, I will try to explain to you in-depth how enemies in Realm of the Mad God communicate. Don't worry if you found this video through any other means. You won't need to have seen Jttyzzle's video to understand this one. Do however be aware that this is the in-depth explanation version, and things might get too computer sciencey for your tastes. So to understand how stuff in a game communicates, first it's important to have a bit of an understanding of how realm things in general work behind the scenes. All objects in this game are defined in XML, which, contrary to what someone might think, isn't really a programming language. It's a document of data which defines what attributes objects have, which the server will read to generate these objects in-game. I won't go in depth with how the server reads and understands XML, that's another story in itself. But don't worry, you won't need to fully understand all that to understand this. The more complicated objects in the game, referred to as characters, think bees, not trees, make use of three attributes that make them appear alive. They have behaviors, states, and transitions. First, here's how behaviors work. A behavior defines something an object has to do. For example, I instruct this example object to wander at a speed of 0.9 and to shoot every 2 seconds. The catch here is that any behavior I give to an object, it will try to execute. If I give something many shoot behaviors, it's going to try and do all of them. This applies to any type of behavior, so movement as well. So usually more than one movement behavior leads to unpredictable enemies, so they hardly exist in the wild. But now, what if I want my object to only do a select few behaviors at a time? This is where states come in. Instead of giving an object everything I would like it to be able to do, I segment the things it could be doing. I can tell the enemy what such a segment is with states. In this example, assume the enemy is in the state 1. In this state, it will wander at a speed of 0.9. And that is all the things that it will be doing right now. Now, assume my enemy starts in state 2. It will wander at a speed 9. Like this, you can choose what an enemy should be doing, dependent on what state it is in. By the way, don't tell things to wander at speed 9. They'll move 9 tiles in any direction every 0.2 seconds. Finally, a state allows you to put a state in it. In this example, since it's already in a state called top level, it's doing wander, again at speed 0.9. Additionally, it will enter the substate called substate. In this substate, it will execute behave, which means that this enemy is now wandering and behaving. Because the enemy is already in substate, it is not in substate 2, and is, as such, not doing the behavior stuff. So, at this point, you're probably wondering, how can you go from one state to another state? Otherwise, putting behaviors in different states is quite useless, since you'd never be able to reach them. This is where transitions come in, and it is also where things might get a bit hairy. Any state has a set of behaviors and substates. Note that these sets can also be empty. And while the enemy is in an arbitrary state, it will enter a substate if possible, and execute all sets of behaviors contained within the states it's in. However, any state also has a set of transitions. Let's call this set T. T defines the conditions required for the enemy to change state. If all the conditions in a transition are met, it will transition to whichever state is specified. Here's a list of some conditions you can put in a transition. Let's take the easiest one, after time, as an example. This is a condition that takes a number which represents the amount of seconds that must elapse before it will transition. As soon as you enter a state that has an after time transition in it, the timer starts ticking. After the time has elapsed, the condition is met. For this example, once again, if the transition is met, it will be executed, and the state will change to, in this case, other state. Another example of this is player within. This condition is met if and only if a player is within a specified amount of tiles distance of the enemy. If a player is within 5 tiles of the enemy, in this example, the enemy will transition to other state. The magic in transitions lies with the fact that you have some additional flexibility that lets you do basic logic. If you put any number of conditions in a single transition statement, you've got a logical AND. All conditions must be met before this transition will evaluate the true. If you put multiple separate transitions in a single state, if any one has its conditions met, or multiple, it will transition. That's a logical OR. Finally, most conditions also have a negation, an opposite. Here's a list of these opposites. As for the two that are missing, that's because a statement for their opposites does not exist within the game, but you can still work something out to make an opposite yourself. Notice how, just like that, we've got ways to make a logical AND, an OR, and a NOT. And with those things, you can represent any logical proposition possible. So, if we can make any logical proposition with transitions, why is it so hard to make enemies communicate? If we can do all the logic, we can compare everything, which means we can write XML to have enemies communicate how to behave dependent on their own status, right? Well, the catch here is that we cannot put anything in our transition conditions. We are limited to those 7 conditions that we can check for and their opposites. Off the time is based on itself. It's the time elapsed since entering one of its own states. Player within is a measure how close a player is to itself. Hit points less than is based on its own health. Tags are little lists of items that the enemy can check. These tags are later to be used in transitions, where you can check whether or not the enemy has them, but it keeps the list private, so they're only accessible by itself. Moving on to more interesting transitions, there's global tags and exist. First, let's talk about global tags. Like the name implies, they are global. Every single object in a dungeon can read the list of global tags associated with their dungeon. You can use a global tag to check for information left behind by a different enemy, like the example below. Right here, Object Weakling and Protector both start off in their respective states 1. Once Object Weakling reaches less than 50% health, it will transition into 2. Here it writes a global tag. As soon as this happens, the Protector object notices that the global tag help me and transitions to state helping, and in this state it protects Object Weakling. Exist and non-exist work the same way. It checks whether or not a specific type of object is still alive, which is global throughout the dungeon. Well, great then. So objects can communicate. That wasn't so hard, and we have not 1 but 2 ways to do it. Or do we? Unfortunately, there is a problem with global tags and exists. Both of these methods are global, which means everyone reads them. Allow me to explain what the problem with that is. Suppose you want a hive to communicate to nearby bees that it's low on health and needs help. You'd have the hive set a global tag for a hit points less than state transition like we saw before. With the bees checking for a global tag of the same name, you can make something happen. Let's say the bee goes and sits on top of the hive when this happens. Since the tag is global, every bee in the dungeon reads this tag. Every bee in the dungeon is going to drop whatever they are doing and sit on top of the nearest hive they can find. In most cases, you really can't have it that every object is gonna drop everything they're doing once they notice a global tag. Essentially, the problem with global tags is that they lack a range factor. This is where one final mechanic kicks in that I've glossed over so far. As I've told you earlier, a state can have a set of substates, a set of behaviors, and a set of transitions. One thing I've neglected to mention so far is that states can also have a set of orders in them. This example object here sends out an order to shoot projectile number 0 every 2 seconds. This order in itself does nothing. It's sending out an order, but to whom? This is where the final piece of the puzzle is at. Any enemy can have a behavior follow orders, which you must fill in with a list of object IDs to listen to. This other example object named 2 does nothing but listen for orders. It will reach out up to 10 tiles with checking for any orders. As long as object 1 isn't near object 2, 2 is just going to stand around waiting for orders. But as soon as object 1 is nearby, number 2 will start shooting his projectile 0, because he's been ordered to do so. In fact, there you have it. That there is the vital range thing that was missing from global tags and exist, required to have functioning communication. Anyway, since everyone is surely here for the logic and set theory behind these things, where transitions are the and, or, and not operators to make logical propositions with, you can think of global tags and orders as universal and existential quantifiers respectively. Moving on, what's also great about orders is that you can use a short and simple order to make a state transition happen. Remember tags? Thanks to this, you can force a transition to a target at any given time if you so desire. Finally, recall that orders can take a set of behaviors, states, and transitions, but not orders, to send out to their targets. Because of this, and your direct control over transitions with the set tag transition trick, you can use orders to command groups of enemies to move as one. Since all the affected targets are executing from the same set of actions, you can be certain that their movement will be synchronous. This synchronous movement is a very powerful tool to have at your disposal. So, with all these tools made possible by orders, can we say that now the object communication problem has been solved? Orders are basically awesome. We can make enemies communicate with each other, do a bunch of cool tricks, and that still wasn't very hard. Problem solved? No. As it turns out, the order mechanic has serious problems when it comes to having enemies communicate with each other. To show where the limitations of orders are, let's take a look at a few hypothetical situations that use orders. First, let's take a look at a boss commanding a bunch of minions. Orders are perfect for bossing around things. Order a bunch of minions to do as you command. This will work, no strings attached. Next, consider two enemies communicating back and forth. Already here, you're going into dangerous territory. Unless the two objects are unique, you will run into orders seemingly not receiving. I'll explain more about that in the next situation. Additionally to this one, even if the two objects are unique and you could use orders for communication, are you sure if you should? Since they're unique, there's no trouble involved with just using global tags, unless you of course want them to do something only when they're in a specific range of each other. Finally, consider a group of enemies communicating to a single object. Suppose you have example 1 again, but this time the direction of order traffic is the other way around. The listener in this case has a group of potential sources to receive an order from. This is where the major limitation of orders lies. You might wonder what happens if two orders are sent at the same time, but it doesn't even come to that. Whenever the follow orders behavior is activated, the listener seeks out the nearest object that is specified and locks onto it. It will listen to this object for orders and this one only. If this locked target is currently not sending an order, but a different object is, that order will get ignored. Even though it's been told by the behavior to listen to that one, it doesn't care, not gonna listen. If the locked target is no longer the closest to the listener, nothing changes. The lock stays and orders get ignored. Only if the locked target dies, the lock is released. It will promptly pick the nearest target again and lock in. Because of this, communicating back and forth between two objects, unless they're unique, is not possible. Many of your sent orders will uncontrollably get dropped which could in turn break the sender because it was depending on a reply. Essentially, you must think of orders as one-way streets. Either a hive orders a bee to do something, or the other way around. But you cannot do both, as the locking mechanic means your orders may go ignored. Fortunately, there is a way around this. Let's return to the bee and hive communication problem. What we've been trying to do all the time is this. 1. We want the hive to communicate with the bee, more specifically in order it to protect the hive once it's attacked. 2nd, we also want the bee to communicate with the hive. When it's low on health, order the hive to heal it. Doing the first one is easy. We tell the bees to listen for orders from the hives. This means bees will lock onto a specific hive, but that's okay in this case because bees are generated by the hive initially, and thus they will stick around and lock on to one specific hive at all times. Once a hive is attacked, our one-way street is put into use. The hive orders the bees to set a tag on themselves. The bees are configured to transition if they have this specific tag, and in this new state, they are set to protect the hive. That's great, 50% of the way there. Next, we want our bees to order hives to heal them when they get low. This is where problems arise since our one-way channel of bee and hive is already taken in the opposite direction. But there is a way around this. All order communication channels might be one-way streets, but there's no known limit to the amount of communication channels we can open. Is there a way to have an external object open a channel with a hive, with the hive as receiver, such that the bee communicates with this object and the object relays this information with the hive? Well, at first glance, having a third object that is listener for bee orders to relay them is no help. It would lock on to listen from a single bee, which is the same problem we'd have if we just let the hive listen for bee orders. However, what if this third object is generated only once it's needed? If the bee generates this object as a substitute for sending out an order, the object doesn't need to listen for bee orders. Since the object existing is validation that the bee needs healing because it's generated for this purpose, the bee doesn't need to send an order himself. Unfortunately, we cannot use the exist transition to check for this object in instances like these, because just like global tags, every object in the dungeon would transition. However, we can have this external object send the heal request order to the hive. Because no other instance of this object previously existed, we are 100% certain that the hive will listen to this one in particular. And just like that, back and forth communication has been established. Now, you might ask, aren't you back to square one? Once a second bee tries to communicate with the hive by object creation, since the hive is already locked in to the previously created relay object. That will be correct, but you assume the previous object is still around. Remember, this external object's only purpose is to relay the order the bee would like to give. Once the order has been done, this object has served its purpose and it can disappear. This would remove the lock until a new one appears. Now, you might ask if the object has to disappear as soon as possible to prevent other orders from being ignored. How do you make sure the order gets executed fully? Keep in mind that the object doesn't have to stay around to make sure the order is executed. Instead of ordering the desired behavior, which would take a few seconds to execute, you order the hive to set a tag. The hive is a transition for when this tag is set, and hence the rest is handled by the hive itself, which means after a single tick, 0.2 seconds, this relay object can disappear and then it's already prepared for the next one. So there you have it. By using a temporary object generated to send an order, you can bypass the one-way street problems that orders have, and you can let objects communicate back and forth. By now, you probably understand why enemy communication isn't very straightforward and quite cumbersome. The ways of communicating are very limited if you want anything more than the basics, and it starts getting a bit hacky. Even this trick isn't the end-all be-all, as each occurrence of sophisticated communication has different requirements. This particular trick relied on one direction of order traffic not having to worry about the locking, Suppose instead you have two groups communicating back and forth, rather than a group with a single object. That would be a real headache to make, as every instance of communication with a group to a singular member of the other group would require this trick. Anyways, I really hope you enjoyed this video and were able to learn a bit from it. It took a lot of time to make, but it was definitely fun. Hopefully, this has answered any questions you were having regarding the trickiness of Realm XML, and if it has not, feel free to ask me anything you're wondering in the comments. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.